Hey everybody. I see some familiar faces out there. I see some new folks. This is like a presentation that I've never done before, and I was just trying to think of something that would be kind of a little offbeat, kind of interesting, kind of engage some interest. So I thought it might be interesting to talk about just what drugs in prison are like what the situation is. So this presentation, I tried to combine doing some research stuff, but also actually, hold on. Did that slide advance? Okay. Um, so I call this presentation A Peek into the Black Box, Drugs in Prison and Drugs Afterward, meaning kind of for people who are re-entering out into the community. Whenever I do a presentation, I try to kind of start with some kind of human interest hook. And so I'm sitting here munching on a string cheese stick, but I would like to poll the audience. I don't like to pull them apart in strings. I just like to chew them like a cylinder. Does anybody else do that, or do you guys like to pull the strings apart? I think that's gross and I don't like it, so I just eat them like this.
Somebody said that's a disorder, Wally.
Well, I'm with you, Ollie.
Yeah. So anyway, hope that got your interest because that was the point of that. So I don't have any financial disclosures. Okay. So this is new for me. I will say one of the trickiest things about doing a presentation you haven't done before is the timing. So I'm going to try to get this to right on the nose. And I think I've got an hour. Is that right? The full hour? Or is that
Yeah,
correct?
I would say probably by like 12:55 you want to be
Yeah.
done.
Okay. So I have tried to draw from published research, current research, and also I don't know what you call it. I don't know, testimony, anecdote from not just mental health people, but other people who work in prisons, security staff, investigation staff, some of the reentry specialists who help with the transition from prison to the community to describe the experience of illicit or misused drugs. I don't know what we're supposed to call them these days, so that's what I'm calling them. While people are in prison, it's probably not a huge secret that there are a lot of drugs in prison. And I thought it might just be interesting, especially for those of you who work in the community, to get a sense of what people's experience is like when they're in prison. In specific, what kind of access they have to drugs, what kind of drugs are floating around, what it's like, how that kind of interacts with the security of the facilities. Um, so I don't know. I hope this is interesting. I hope this will, and then just to kind of make it fun, I went to all the reentry specialists, and I thought just a nice twist to end it up would be I asked them to give reflections on what they wish community providers knew from their experience about watching people transition from being incarcerated to being out in the community. So I think it's related, but it's kind of a separate, I don't know. It's just what I thought would be interesting. So I don't know. I hope you find this engaging and interesting. I just pulled up Google Maps. And so this photo you might be familiar with, you might not. This is the main Idaho complex of prisons. If you've never been familiar with this, this is about 5 miles south of the airport on Pleasant Valley Road. This is the South Boise complex. We also have prisons out in Pocatello, up in north in Orofino, and in Cottonwood. But I don't know, I'd guess 85% of our correctional population in Idaho is in this complex that's about 5 miles south of the airport. I'm not going to show you each of the facilities, but there's about 6 facilities out there. There's also some CRC and some other things. But for the most part, this is where most of the people who are incarcerated in Idaho are spending their time. This represents different facilities, different security levels. And I remember this is from a little bit pre-COVID, but there was a article in the New York Times that talked about prisons as a black box. And so that's why I called this presentation A Peek into the Black Box. And I went and found that old article, and it said, just a quote, "Prisons are the black boxes of our society. With their vast complexes and razor wire barriers, everyone knows where they are, but few know what goes on inside. Prisoner communication is sharply curtailed, it is monitored, censored, and costly. Visitation rules are strict." So I suspect a lot of people out there are working with clients who've spent time in prison or maybe jail. But I think a lot of providers don't really have a great sense of what is going on in there. I think some of you who know me, I went back to school for my doctorate later in life. My earlier career was mostly as a probation officer. And for the most part, I knew, I was part of the criminal justice system. Sometimes we sent people off to prison, but it's just like they disappear. And then after a period of time, they come back and we try to pick up where they went. But I had very little understanding what happened during that time. And I wouldn't doubt that a lot of you might feel the same way. So today, my intention is to give you a little peek in the black box. Article from just a couple of years ago: prisons disproportionately confine people who have extensive histories of illicit drug use and tend to hold groups of people who continue using drugs, albeit in different forms and different amounts. Prisoners' desire or physical compulsion to use illicit drugs fundamentally structures almost all aspects of everyday prison life. This extends to individuals who do not use illicit drugs and is felt even in prisons in which drugs are not readily available. So I like that quote. If I could just kind of break down what I see in that quote, I suspect for those of us who don't have lived experience with addiction, you can still imagine if you're using any substance extensively and all of a sudden you're in an environment which kind of cuts it off, like that doesn't stop the urge, all the stuff that goes along with that. And even if you yourself are not using, you're surrounded by people who may be finding ways to get access to substances, sometimes in ways that are really dangerous. Suddenly you get gang involvement as they're kind of controlling movement, which means sometimes you have to get involved with really scary people, even if you don't want to. And so even if you're not using, you're around it, and it's shaping a lot of the experience of the daily life of being incarcerated. I'd actually be curious, for those of you who work with people who are formerly incarcerated, I know this isn't live, so we can't just have a discussion, but I'm curious if you hear people talk about it. If when you're doing services of whatever sort, if that comes up, if you know what your clients were dealing with or what it was like for them. If anybody has anything interesting, put it in the chat, but it's really just a food for thought, I guess. All right, my own little story. This is the Plainfield Correctional Facility in Plainfield, Indiana, about 15 miles outside of Indianapolis to the west. This is the first facility that I was the lead psychologist at after I'd completed my doctorate and my internship, and I kind of worked as a line person. And so this is a medium security prison in Indiana, but this is the first time I had a chance to be the lead psychologist. And in this prison, if any of you ever worked in corrections, this is back about, 15 years ago, something like that. When I got there, I realized probably 75% of our population was prescribed Wellbutrin. And I, had kind of come from the community. And so Wellbutrin to me just didn't raise any alarms. Wellbutrin's not what I think of as a drug of abuse. I feel like if I had a couple Wellbutrin tabs and I went out to a street corner and tried to sell them, ain't nobody wanting to buy Wellbutrin for the most part, in my experience. This isn't like Suboxone or Ativan or, something like that. But it became very clear something was going on because Wellbutrin was everywhere. And I kept getting all these healthcare requests. Hey, Campbell, I need to get on an antidepressant, having huge mental health troubles. Oh, by the way, I'm allergic to everything except Wellbutrin, or only Wellbutrin works for me. And so I'm asking around. And, in prison, a lot of times mental health, we work alongside security, but a lot of times there's a lot of separation. I don't know what they think. But I would talk to security officers like, are you seeing, what is going on? And they're like, oh, yeah, they crush it up and they snort it. Everybody's using Wellbutrin. At that time, some people were mixing it with Remeron. I don't know. It's just the kind of thing. And so I was a little unprepared for that, just because I hadn't really run into Wellbutrin at some of the places I was working before. But Wellbutrin was everywhere, and people were clamoring for Wellbutrin. And I remember I was talking to some resident, inmate, whatever we called him back then, and I'm like, "Look, just level with me. What is going on with Wellbutrin? Like, what happens if you crush Wellbutrin and snort it?" And he's like, you get, I don't know, a mild buzz, kind of low elevated heart rate, lasts about 20 minutes. He said, it's not much, but Campbell, when we're in here, like I know guys who sniff their ramen noodle flavor packets. Like when you're desperate, you'll do anything. And also here, you can sell your Wellbutrin. If you can figure out how to cheek it in a way that won't be seen and get it back to the dorm, people will pay for it. And then you can buy things that you might like because, we don't have much access to things. A lot of us are poor. We don't have money, people to send us money on the books. And so there was this whole almost like economy of Wellbutrin that I was kind of indirectly responsible for providing. I mean, I'm a psychologist, I don't prescribe, but kind of played a gatekeeper role. And so I was trying to think like, okay, so what is my role here? What am I going to do about this? Because you got to ask yourself, like, should we just say, look, we're not here to be a barrier to care. If people want Wellbutrin, give it to them. Or do we say we're going to draw a hard line and not allow people to take Wellbutrin? We're going to, direct them to other ways. What if Wellbutrin really is a great med for somebody? Do we want to take it away from them? Is it security's job to manage diversion or contraband, whatever you call it? And I stumbled on this article, Wellbutrin, misuse and abuse by incarcerated individuals. And this was kind of for me the first time I realized, oh, this isn't just a Plainfield Correctional Facility problem. This is a nationwide problem. And it was the first time I saw a research article that I was like, oh, dang, this is opening my eyes to the fact that this is all over the place. And I'm not going to get into the specific article, but this was just kind of my first realization about how much of an impact drugs play in prison, because this directly overlapped with my professional world. I always knew there was drugs in prison, but for the most part, it was kind of easy. Like, not my thing. I don't want to know. Don't tell me about it. I'm going to have to tell security. So I just kind of was able to stay blissfully unaware of what was going on. And for the most part, unless you're gathering that, like unless you're intentional about getting people to talk to you about the drugs in prison, that's secret. It's a secret world, and it's got a whole shadow economy surrounded. People don't want to talk about it. So this was the first time that I really came face to face with, I have a role in this problem, and I have to have some kind of role in figuring out how we're going to deal with that. So since then, I've spent years in prison. We've had all kinds of different ways we've managed those kind of problems. But that was kind of my first-hand walk into this kind of thing. Now, drugs is contraband. The reason I say here is in prison world, drugs are, we think for the most part, I assume that people who are on this call think of drugs as something that when you misuse it, or I forget what we're supposed to call it now, when drugs are, whether they're illicit drugs or prescription drugs being used contrary to their purpose, it's a treatment issue. But in prison, it's a treatment issue and it's a contraband issue. And by contraband, I mean it's one of the many things that it becomes a security issues. So contraband refers to any item that an inmate is prohibited from having. So drugs are viewed like weapons, like cell phones, like mail is a whole different thing. We'll talk about mail in a minute. But so drugs fall into like a security thing. Now, I realize there's a parallel there in the community where drugs are kind of a law enforcement issue as opposed to a treatment issue. But in prison, it's got its own specific flavor about how drugs get managed. I pulled up this little thing from a correctional trade magazine that just talks, this is an ad actually for, hey, we're a company that helps prisons figure out how to manage contraband by detecting and managing drones and cell phones and using technology to find this kind of stuff. Again, probably sounds similar to a lot of the law enforcement attitude toward drugs. But as I want you to kind of see as we get into this presentation, it's got its own real specific flavor in a correctional environment. The main smuggling routes identified in research literature, this is from 22, are through visitors, mail, prisoners on reception, that means people coming in from jails, remand, this probably was a British article because remand I've never heard used in the United States, but that's like I'm not even sure what that is. I think it's like a short-term stay or something. Work release and staff. And then perimeter throwovers are a thing. But all these differ between prisons depending on various contextual factors and security measures in place. I'm going to go back a couple slides. I want to show you something I thought was funny. Can you see my cursor, or do you see my cursor? Okay, so right here, this little 3 windows that I'm circling, do you see that? That was my office. And this was the main entrance down here. So when I came in the morning, I had to walk this little track into this building here. And one time right here, I see this electric tape. It looked kind of like a football-sized oval, this ball all wound up in electric tape. And at first I went to pick it up thinking it was just trash or something like that. And this guy in this security tower gets on the loudspeakers like, yeah, Campbell, don't touch that. I'm like, oh, I thought I was being helpful picking up trash. He's like, Campbell, back away. And I'm just like, what? I don't understand what's going on. And then he sends a bunch of dudes out there. And it was what we call a throwover. Someone had just, so you can see down here is the parking lot. And probably like at 2 a.m. when there was low staff or who knows what, somebody probably came right over here and just chucked this ball or whatever it is, probably full of drugs. I don't know what was in it. I didn't get that involved. Maybe cell phones, something like that. But that's what we call throwovers. So sometimes people are kind of pre-arranging through phone conversations where something's going to be and when. So some prisoner can, ideally get over there and position themselves to, get this thing. Now, different facilities lend themselves to that more or less. As you can see, this is all, you don't know this, but this is all staff area. That was some miscommunication. They threw it to an area where it was never going to go. It should have come over here by the housing units. I suspect there was just some miscommunication. But anyway, that's just one of my little ha-ha stories. So that when you hear about throwovers, that's what a throwover is. Some prisons have a lot of distance between the fence where a throwover is not very useful, but some in more urban areas where space is an issue are going to have fences right up tight. And one thing I'd just like to point out is due to a number of ethical challenges, first of all, the need for safeguarding the free participation of people, the research in custodial settings is still limited. So really, most of the quote unquote research is on the correctional and security side. It's not on academics and treatment providers doing research on drugs in prison. Doing research in prison is really challenging. And so when I talk to you about this stuff, I'm going to use a lot of just my own experiences. I'm going to use conversations I've had with people because there's just not a ton of really great research on the experience of drugs in prison. This will probably come as no surprise to anybody, but in jails and prisons, probably not all that unlike the criminal justice system out in the community, punishment tends to be the way we manage this kind of stuff. If you get caught with drugs, if you have a urine analysis and it shows that you were using, punishment tends to be the response. We're going to put you in segregation for 30 days, or we're going to restrict your phone calls, or we're going to, blah, 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 what all the different things we can do. And so I feel like in prisons, there's the treatment mindset is still quite a bit behind the, sorry, what did I just say? The treatment mindset is quite a bit behind the security mindset. That's a cultural issue as far as I'm concerned. I've worked in prisons in several different states. This isn't just an Idaho thing, but it tends to be that we punish drug use as a way of responding to it. Now, I also like to point out, we don't do substance use treatment per se in the Idaho prisons. Some states do, some states do not. Prisons tend to be state organizations that all run very separately. So depending on what state you get locked up in, you're going to probably have a very, very different experience. But I like just to try to get your mindset as to kind of what's happening in prison. First of all, there's mental health treatment. That's part, and that's what I do. I'm in charge of mental health treatment. And in our world, mental health treatment falls under the medical care umbrella because that's how courts have determined it's going to be over the course of many years. And one thing I really like to emphasize is in prisons, treatment for mental health or medical problem falls under an informed consent model, which means you don't have to participate if you don't want to. And we cannot let, say, like a punishment happen. You can't get dinged on parole because you wouldn't participate in mental health treatment. You get to hear the risks and benefits. And if you say no thanks, that's your own business. You can't be punished by that. If you think about it, that's one of the real main legal reasons we have to keep substance use treatment and sex offender treatment very separate, because those are not only mental, treatment issues, but those are also criminal behavior. And so if you opt out of treatment, you most definitely will get dinged at your parole hearing. Well, you're not going home, you're going to have to stay, blah, blah, blah. So I think if there's any lawyers out there, what we refer to as a liberty interest, if you decline medical or mental health treatment, there's no liberty interest involved in that, which means it doesn't affect when you go home. But if you decline to participate in sex offender or substance use treatment, that most 100% definitely will have a liberty interest, which means you won't go home as soon as you're hoping. So there's kind of not only treatment considerations, but there's this legal distinction that we have to make because these people are not able to choose. I mean, they can choose, but they'll be punished essentially, as a court would see it, if they don't participate in the treatment. And then lastly, we have kind of the criminal rehabilitation programming. And that's more about treating people's criminal thinking, which can overlap with mental health treatment, but is actually a completely separate thing, as the research shows. So when you hear about treatment or programming in prison, I want you to be able to understand that there's three different kind of threads or tracks that can all be working at the same time, or maybe people are opting out of some and others, but it's not all just one umbrella. I do mental health treatment. I'm not involved in those other areas, and vice versa. Okay, so I thought it might be interesting just to kind of get some news clips, just for fun. These are all people from that Plainfield facility, so I didn't run the risk of having any local Idaho people that might be on this call or might know about. These are examples of staff people who were caught bringing drugs into prison. If you've ever been into prison, every prison has a different kind of like entry procedure. I spent a lot of my life in maximum security prisons where you would expect every day when you came in to get patted down. You had to go through a metal detector, kind of like TSA. You had to put all your belongings through a metal detector. That was just part of the daily routine. Anytime you went out for lunch, you had to come back and allot, 10, 15 minutes to do that again. Other facilities are pretty loose, come in, maybe we'll kind of run a wand over you or something like that. I've seen people, like I saw a correctional officer get busted because he would bring in chili, but he froze it, right? And he would just say, I can't always have access to a refrigerator, so I bring it in frozen, and by lunch I expect it'll be thawed out. Well, that made for an ideal way to put baggies of drugs into the chili. Because for the most part, unless you were super duper motivated, nobody's going to take a knife and really dig into that. But anyway, staff is most definitely one of the ways that drugs get into prison. Staff bringing them in. Obviously, if you're coming into a facility every day, if you have a motivation to find a weakness in that entry procedure, you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of opportunities to look for a weak spot. And so that can be medical staff, that can be really anybody. But that is absolutely one of the ways that drugs get into prison. Visitors. This might not surprise you, but visitors bring in drugs. I had to provide treatment for a guy who was very upset, rightfully so, because he had convinced his wife to smuggle drugs in the diaper of his newborn baby. And that got caught, which means mom's now looking at being arrested, which means the baby's looking at foster care. And this guy was obviously really upset, right? Because he's watching his wife get arrested. He knows the baby's probably going to foster care. And he knows he was the one that was arranging this thing. And so I'm charged with like providing mental health services to help him deal with this, which is an unpleasant place to be. But, this is just, these show up in the news. Once you're arrested, it kind of becomes this public thing. Again, this is Indiana, just because I didn't want to do a thing. This picture over here, you'll see a lot of these if you ever do visitation. This is from New Hampshire. I just like the picture. They'll put a bunch of pictures up, signs up warning people. We know a lot of you are under pressure from the people in this prison to bring drugs in. We're trying to warn you off before you walk in, because once you do, that's a criminal act, and you can see the kind of stuff that's going to happen here. So comes in from staff, comes in from visitors. The new thing you might not be surprised to hear are drones. You can fly a drone over a prison and have it drop whatever in some prearranged area. And for the most part, we are playing catch up with that technology. When I started working in prisons, there was certainly nobody ever worried about the open top of a prison because there was no technology besides a helicopter that would get you there, which would obviously get a lot of attention. But now these drones are so impressively, quiet and subtle that it's becoming a challenge that we're trying to play catch up with. Mail, I'm going to show you some pictures of how it comes in through the mail very frequently. And then obviously I mentioned earlier throwovers. There's all kinds of ways they can do this kind of stuff. Anyway, these are the primary ways that you're going to see drugs getting into prison. Now, I went out to the mail room, which is out in that South Boise complex, and they have a training manual because all the mail has to go through this central location. And they have a training manual for new staff that are pictures of ways people have smuggled drugs into the mail. And I just wanted to take a few slides to show you this is pictures from the training manual. In fact, I see Patrick. Patrick, you're the one that cued me into this, so thank you. I don't know if you can tell what this picture is. If we were in a group, I'd try to do a little discussion, but that never works on these Zoom calls. These are stamps that have Suboxone strips attached to the back. So they just lick around that so that the stamp is only adhered to on the outside. And then the middle is a recoverable Suboxone strip. And so I want to take a special minute to talk about Suboxone, because one of the challenges we have is Suboxone is for a long time been a very common drug of abuse and kind of smuggling in, because it's in those little Listerine strip kind of little format, which is a very easy format, or whatever the word is, to get smuggled in. And so a lot of times in terms of the culture of prison, part of the battle we have about bringing in MOUD programs is the attitude towards Suboxone is we've been fighting the Suboxone fight for a long, long time. And now you want to bring in more Suboxone. So this is one of the things we're dealing with, but you can at least understand why it becomes a culture challenge as well as just a procedure challenge. The investigation team told me that meth is currently, like in the last year, a big deal that can come in a lot of different forms. Powders and crystals are the most common ways. Suboxone, I'll show you a lot of pictures, comes into the mail very easily. And they also said that an interesting thing they've been finding is, residents have, radios and little things they can purchase. And when they have to send them out, they only send them to like approved fixer-upper places. And they find that sometimes when they come back, for ways they haven't figured out why, sometimes those radios, like you send out a radio for repair, and when it comes back, it's stuffed chock full of Suboxone strips, because you can cram a lot of those in there, much more than you can a pill. I thought that was kind of interesting. I hadn't really heard that before. Spice is a big one. Spice you can spray onto paper, and then the person could kind of like suck the paper, so a letter could easily be kind of soaked in the spice. It can be difficult to kind of visually scan. And they told me, if you have a piece of paper that's been soaked in spice, you can cut it into 1 by 1 inch squares, and that's $10,000 a page when you break down how much that is. You can also smoke that. They said heroin comes in sometimes. It's not as big, but it's still there. And they said one way that they find that a lot is it's in the spines of books, like a hardback book that when you open, there's the little kind of cover that's separate from the pages, not a paperback where it's all one, but like that area is a common place to stick heroin. Fentanyl is in the news a lot. You probably hear about fentanyl. They said really it's much less common because there's more specific laws about fentanyl that make it more intimidating to smuggle in. And honestly, they said a lot of people are afraid of dying by overdose or killing somebody by overdose. So because fentanyl is in the news, it actually is decreasing in commonness because there's other things that feel like they're less risky to smuggle in. In terms of detection, one thing that the IDOC is moving toward is providing tablets for everybody, electronic tablets. And part of that is so people can communicate with their loved one on email, and maybe we'll get to video calls, but it also decreases the amount of paper mail because all that mail has to be kind of managed, scanned, looked through, whatever. And so if we can turn some of that to electronic communication, it's more instantaneous for the people sending the mail, but it also eases the burden up on trying to manage the actual paper mail coming into the facilities. Blah, 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 blah. The rest you can read. Okay, so here are some illustrations from the training manual. These are examples of pages where Suboxone was put into liquid form and then dried up into kids' coloring pages. I'm not 100% sure I understand what's going on here, but I would imagine a lot of people get mail from their kids. And if they're color pages, if you have a discoloration, if you just keep it in the lines, it's hard to detect that as a problem. It just looks like something a child has been playing with or coloring or whatever. You can see these are someone sent in magazines, and those perfume strips had been kind of subtly pried off. And then you can cram a bunch of drugs into those perfume strips and then re-adhere them. They said it's pretty easy to make it look like it was never opened. And then also you can see, I'm pointing, you can't tell where it is, but in the adhesive of the envelope itself becomes an easy place to attach some of these strips, these Suboxone strips. And that's the same picture. I think that slide wasn't supposed to be there. Sorry. Here's an example of fake legal mail. This is what legal mail should look like, as opposed to what someone just kind of made up fake legal mail. Obviously, if you know what you're looking at, it's not hard to see, but if you're just scanning through hundreds and hundreds of letters, it would be pretty easy to miss that. Because, sorry, I should add, you can't search legal mail. So if you make legal mail, that can't be searched. So if you fake legal mail, you have a good chance of that sliding through because it can't be searched. So they have to be, attuned to what's real legal mail and what's not. These are cards that have been soaked in meth. Again, they're just cards, greeting cards, and then they just soak them in this meth, and then they, dry them out, flatten them. Hard to detect that unless you're really paying close attention to that. So that's part of what the challenge the mailroom faces. Anyway, I just wanted to show you some examples of how the drugs are getting into prison. Prescription meds is absolutely an issue, misusing prescription meds. It's still present, although we have really tightened up a lot of our technology so that, we're just opening a blister pack, more controlled ways, and there's increased security auditing process of med distribution. So in the old days, nurses would show up with just a big tray full of different pills, and they're kind of, trying to kind of find the right one for the right person. The technology has improved enough that investigation said it still happens, but it's not our big concern anymore. She did say a lot of meds are used because they're perceived to enhance a high. She said gabapentin is one that in her investigation shows up a lot as a med that by itself isn't really one to get high on, but it enhances the high. And down at the bottom, I put the word inmate.com, which if you've never heard that, that's kind of a slang term for the incarcerated people's kind of like word of mouth network. And so like a lot of times, I don't know why this is, but I've worked in prisons for a long time. There's kind of drugs that are rumored to get you high, and you can always tell when there's a big run on some certain meds. Like I remember at one point, Effexor became really, everybody's looking for Effexor. Everybody wants Effexor. Then it's Zyprexa. Everybody wants Zyprexa. And a lot of times it's hard to know exactly what's going on in the background, but this, people will start spreading a story, whether it's true or not. And often it's pretty questionable whether it is or not, but like, this is the med you want to get. You can get high on this. And that story just seems to change from, I don't know, season to season. It's always hard to know where those things come from, but there's definitely kind of a word of mouth network about what's going on. Okay, it's quarter till. I'm going to shift gears. Anybody have any questions? I'm not even looking at the chat. Are there any questions, any thoughts, any comments? I don't know was that even interesting? I'm just trying to give you a little hint of what my world is like. Okay. So should I look at this chat? Someone else tell me if there's something in chat I should respond to. I'm not going to look at that myself.
Everybody's saying it's very interesting.
Okay.
No questions yet.
Okay. So I'm going to shift gears. We only got about 10 minutes-ish. So what I want to do is I just ask some of our staff who work with re-entry. And what I mean by that is about, 30 to 90 days prior to release, we start connecting people with plan, and those who kind of have more complicated needs get assigned a re-entry specialist. So I reached out to these re-entry specialists. I'm like, if you just, now that we've been doing this for, a couple of years, if you could talk to community providers, what would you want to say? And so I want to share the messages. They said such interesting things. I said, rather than me summarize, I'm just going to quote it. And so I don't know how this is going to go, but I'm just going to throw this at you. And if you have anything to say, please do. I love talking about this stuff. Here's the first one. A lot of text, sorry. Clients released from prison are usually very nervous. And if it's their first time on parole, they're unsure of what they need to do and probably how to do it. If a client's on mental health medication, they release with a 30-day supply. I don't know if you all know that, but when you walk out the door, you get 30 days worth of pills. And these clients need to be a priority for the agency's doctors so there's not a gap in medication. If they don't have their I-9 documents, help obtain them. Most of our clients don't have transportation, so it's not easy to get across town. If you can schedule their one-on-one sessions around group, it can help to limit the burden. Put them in the appropriate treatment. Don't put them in a PHP if they don't need it. If you can't or don't offer it, please refer them to an agency that does. Treatment should be focused on what's best for your client, not your bank account. Ooh, shots fired. But I do want to make sure everybody knows this. When I don't know if you all know that, maybe this is old news, but when people release, they release with a 30-day amount of the actual medication and then a prescription to kind of bridge that. But, that can, depending on access to a provider, getting that renewed can be really challenging. And remember, they're on a pretty limited formulary here, so there might be a medication that's better, but they're going to run out of those meds before too long. So I think the emphasis here is on the time frame. Community treatment providers need to understand people releasing from prison are navigating massive transitions with very limited support. Those releasing are dealing with being institutionalized, which is kind of what we've been talking about here, stigma around criminal status, different levels of trauma, and a lack of basic resources. Community providers are expecting them to engage in treatment as if they're starting on a level playing field, and often that's not the case. This is where individualized plans, approaches should really be utilized because cookie cutter approaches aren't going to get it. All right. If you got any thoughts, throw them up there. I would say, Mr. or Mrs. Anonymous, that I wish they knew the stressors that our clients are facing immediately upon release. They have so many things to get done, and normally income is at the top of their list. Sometimes treatment is an addition they can't handle or don't want to, and they need people who are going to understand the struggles and how everything is so interconnected. I do think we all tend to be a little on the silo-ish side, and it's easy to forget that it reminds me when I was in school and some professors loading on homework, and you're like, that would be fine if this was my only class, but I've got 4 other classes that they're all doing the same thing too. So this comment just made me remember that thing where you feel overloaded, and it's not that any one thing is too much, it's that when they're all together, it feels like you're swamped. This anonymous individual would like for treatment providers to be more understanding in accommodation to transportation barriers. That came up before, here it comes again. Many of our clients are released from incarceration with very little money, which they usually need to use for rent or food. And oftentimes they have limited support as well. It can take clients a year or longer to save up for a vehicle. I've had many clients discharged from treatment due to the inability to find stable transportation, and it's not due to a lack of trying. In addition, discharging a client from treatment can jeopardize their sobriety and cause more issues. Now, I'm not blind to why someone might not happen if they're not showing up, but I do think this is a nice comment to give a little context as to what may be happening in those situations. Sometimes it's difficult for our clients to get into substance use treatment when they're newly released from facilities or jails because they do not meet the criteria of using within the last 30 to 90 days. It seems like a shame that we have to wait until the relapse before we can get them into treatment, especially if the treatment is ordered by the parole board. Again, I can see why this would happen, but it's a case where systems don't always line up very nicely. The systems can miss each other. Mental health care for individuals leaving prison is often hailed as a cornerstone of successful reentry. Yet its effectiveness is fatally undermined when disconnected from systemic reforms. Preach. While therapy, counseling, and medication-assisted treatment are critical tools, they cannot single-handedly counteract the destabilizing forces of homelessness, unemployment, or transportation barriers. To treat mental health in isolation is to ignore a fundamental truth: psychological well-being is inextricably tied to material security. All right, thought-provoking. I'm with you there. Last one. Ultimately, the goal is to recognize that mental health cannot thrive in a vacuum. Oh, this is actually a continuation of the previous one. A stable mind requires a stable life. Providers who ignore this interdependence risk perpetuating cycles of crisis where temporary relief is swiftly erased by systemic neglect. True recovery demands we treat not only the individual, but the ecosystem in which they live. By pairing clinical expertise with unwavering advocacy for housing, economic justice, and transportation equity, mental health care can evolve from a Band-Aid into a catalyst for lasting change. Anything less is a disservice for those fighting to rebuild their lives. All right, it's about 10 till, and I'll wrap up by saying, if you're working with people coming out of prison, don't make the mistake of thinking they've been drug-free. Drugs are commonly found in prison, and even if your people aren't using them, they've been in an environment that was largely shaped by these underground forces of finding ways to obtain them and use them and, all that stuff. They're not only a security issue, but a treatment issues that prisons admittedly do not do well in addressing, and successful reentry efforts are needed to understand individuals' use patterns while incarcerated. All right. I don't know. I don't want to even start the next section because I feel like we're just about out of time. So I've got a couple more, but I feel like that's really what I wanted to say. And if we could use the last few minutes for any comments, thoughts, questions, I'd much rather do that than just bore you with going on and on with my little lecture.
That sounds great. We already have a couple questions in the chat. You can go ahead and stop your share, Wally. We had a question from Alexis that said, I'm curious if you feel folks you work with are more likely to talk to you as your role as a psychologist because you aren't a part of the security bubble and don't prescribe, like a good middle person because you have good rapport with folks.
Yeah. So first of all, just to clarify, I don't work in the prisons. I work at central office. I'm just a boring policy guy. But for those working in the prisons, like I see a couple of you out there, Dominguez, who have been in this role. I do think, for the most part, residents see mental health providers differently than security, and often they will talk to us about this kind of stuff. There are limitations, like it's a pretty big deal to get caught, and so some of them are like, I don't want to risk that. And so I would say, here's what I would honestly say. I've worked in prison. I first worked in prisons in 1990. So, I mean, I've been around for a long time. And I will say one thing is, no matter how much you think you know about what these people's lives are like, just because you work there, you don't know. I'm constantly amazed at how little I know when things come up. I find out something's been going on. So I would say, yes, we do find out some stuff, but it's never clear how much we're really finding out. Some people are pretty open, some are never going to tell you a thing. But I never feel like I really know for sure what's going on. People are sometimes like, I used to have people who'd come in for Wellbutrin back in the old days, and I would look at them like, bro, come on, let's get real here. And he would say, Campbell, the truth is the gangs are pressuring me to get this prescription so I can hand it off to them. And if you don't get me this prescription, like my ass is on the line because I bet on the Super Bowl and I still owe $500 that I can't pay. And so like, oh, okay, there's a huge story behind this. It's not just like, oh, drug dude wants his fix. It's like, there's a whole thing going on here. But I often suspect things like that are happening, but not everybody feels comfortable talking about that whole story like that. I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, so I wanted to bring this one up too. So Rich said, interestingly enough, doing assessments on the recently released 95% denied use during prison doesn't seem to be an avenue to know if you're actually using in prison.
It's very finding out from self-report is I would just say you got to really develop trust before you can feel confident in the answers you're getting. Because, my analogy to that is people come in and tell me, so when I deal with people that are coming in, so if I'm doing an intake, someone's going to be telling me about what their jail experience was like. And some are very open, some are, everything was fine, but like, I'm often like, I'm not really sure how much I'm getting of what really happened in there. Jails are rough. A lot of people come in having had a very difficult experience. They tend to be less programming heavy. It's just a lot of downtime. Sometimes some of the safety stuff's not as well monitored. Jail to jail can be hugely different. So like my analogy would be me hearing about what happened in jail. And you just never really know what you're finding out. So at least I think if you can be coming across as at least competent to what the issues are, that can be a trust builder. If you can communicate to someone, I'm not naive, I might not know the whole story, but I'm not stupid, I get some of these things. I think that can at least build enough trust that you can start creating paths to have some of that more open communication, because I wouldn't be surprised people don't want to just come out and talk about that stuff. Dominguez, I see your bald old mug out there. You got anything you want to add? You've been in the prison.
Bring me into this, but you guys, he's being humble. He spends more time out in the prisons than he lets on. No, and you hit it, Wally. You're going to get a different story depending upon how they're feeling and how they feel they can relate to you at the moment. So
yeah. Tricky to ever really know.
We had another comment from Caitlin about was that the quilting documentary, Caitlin, on Netflix about quilts? A different one? No? She said a documentary on Netflix, the prison experiment. It's from the H unit in Arkansas, where it is a resident ran. I believe it's still working for that facility. Caitlin, do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, it's just a documentary that's on Netflix where the warden of the prison, it's a men's prison, wanted to try an experiment, for lack of better terms, where he left a whole unit and had it ran so there's no staff from the prisons that run it at all, and it's all just resident ran. And at first I think they had a lot of issues, but as far as I know, it's still up and running, and it's been pretty successful in the way that the residents are handling it. They do have politics, but they're a lot less gang affiliated in their politics, which was just pretty cool. It's a really interesting watch.
I find most prisons, one thing I always like to say is, especially a funny dynamic of prisons is, in some ways, higher security prisons run differently than you think, because a lot of times lower security prisons where people are less like dangerous or whatever, there's in some ways the opportunities for programming are less. because the people aren't staying there very long. Like, they're not very invested. They're just trying to do their time and get out and get back home. But if you get into a high security prison where people are doing very long terms, in many ways, they're making a home for themselves. And so I heard quilting. I don't know if this is what you're referencing, but I used to work in a prison where the honors dorm had a big quilt program. And a lot of these big, tough dudes are sitting there with sewing machines making quilts because it's a great time killer. I mean, in truth, it's also a great way to tuck drugs into something. But, that's not what we're. But so, yeah, I do think there are innovative programs out there, but it's also very tricky to try to get the right people into those programs. But yeah, I'm not familiar with what you're talking about, but that sounds really cool and interesting.
I wonder, I'm just going to add one more question that I have for you. I wonder if you have any feedback I know a lot of other outside businesses are starting to partner with the prisons we have in Idaho and giving the residents better pay. I think Nike did one with them, and now I believe the women's prison has some type of video something. Do you think that helps them be more prepared so they can have more money saved aside for when they do get released?
Yeah, like most of the jobs in prison are literally pennies a day. And so anytime we can do partnerships where people have opportunities to make money and can be thoughtful about using that money to kind of start preparing for going home, that's always a really powerful tool. It also comes with risk because the truth is a lot of these folks have not developed great skills. And once they got money, I'm not going to lie, can get weird. And especially if you're working out in the community, maybe, we have a lot of people leave the prison and go into the community for the day. And that does open up opportunities to get access to things that they bring back. So yeah, I mean, in general, I love those things, but I also feel like you have to be kind of smart and prudent about how you're managing a program like that. Hey, we're probably about the end of our time. I honestly, give your sincere feedback. I would love to know if this is interesting, if this is something to develop further, if you're all like, okay, it's interesting, but nobody cares, or if you're like, this was super boring. Honestly, I would love candid feedback because, like I said, I've never done this one before, and I don't know if people find it interesting. So please don't hold back in your feedback.
So, Wally, I think it's really interesting. And I think for a lot of people in practice, especially younger therapists coming out of school, this is something that there's an assumption that it's very regulated, that it's very unlikely that people are getting substances while in prison, and not having that thought process of inquiring about that when they find out that they've just been released. So I think it's interesting to see the creative ways that people are making it work and still engaging in use, but even being exposed to that with that pressure and that culture and how that's going to impact them coming back into the community. Additionally, the points at the end with those quotes and that information, I think that those are little gems there for us to take and really consider out in the community as far as the hardship and not recognizing enough, in my experience, the dynamic and how complicated it is just with transitioning from a controlled environment to the community again. And we know that they were a part of the community before. The community has often changed quite drastically.
Yeah.
So that adds other stressors. And really keeping that in mind when we are doing our clinical diligence, but taking that holistic approach, seeing how things are balancing out and what's actually going to be helpful and beneficial for them now, considering all those other areas that they're responsible for tending to as well. So I think this was very valuable and entertaining as well. Thank you.
I'll tell you just a super quick thing about reentry. Like, this one guy I worked with had spent, he was a long term. He'd been in prison a long time. And he told me, so he gets out and he comes back. I see him 6 months later. I'm like, oh my God, you're back. What? And he goes, Campbell, my mom picked me up. She's an old woman now. And she said, oh, I'm so glad you're out. Let me take you. I'm going to take you home. So we're driving home. And she goes, I need to fill up with gas. You fill up the car and I'm going to run inside and get you some snacks so you can have candy and soda or something like that. So she hands him the credit card, but she's like, I don't even know. I guess I remember these. He said, I get out of the car and the gas pump is a computer. I don't understand what I'm looking at. And I went around to the back of the car to pull the license plate down, which if you're old like me, you remember is where the gas used to be. And he goes, the license plate won't come down. People are starting to look at me. I can't figure out where the gas thing is. I finally see this square cut into the side of the car, but I can't open it. He said, I knew I'm not going to make it out here. I can't even operate the gas to fill up the car. And he said, I knew immediately this is not going to work. I'll be back pretty soon. And that story just always stayed with me, just to recognize how the world has changed and they're almost coming out of a time capsule. And that's a really scary place to be.
Wally, I want to thank you so much for being here today. We already have a ton of really positive pieces of feedback coming in through the chat. I do want to remind you guys that you are able to leave your comments and feedback for us in the survey that you take, and all of those will go directly to Wally. So any feedback that you have, please put that in the survey when you take that to get your CE credits, and we'll send that along to Wally so that he has it. But thank you so much, Wally. This was really great. We always love having you here. As somebody said, they always try to come to your presentation. So you do have a fan club. It's
All
true.
right.
We are going to be